She didn't die when the bullet struck her husband. She didn't die when the empire collapsed around her. She died much slower and crueler. In a cold stone room in Belgium, for more than 60 years, a woman lived without living. She whispered to shadows. She feared her food was poisoned. She refused to bathe, refused to be seen, refused to believe her husband was gone. They called her mad. They locked her away. And the world forgot that she had once ruled as Empress of Mexico. Her name was Charlotte of Belgium, daughter of a king, wife of an emperor. But history only remembers her tears. This is not the story of her reign. It's the story of what grief did to a crown, what madness did to a woman left behind. Because in the end, it wasn't bullets that broke her. It was love. It was hope. It was being left alone to carry the corpse of an empire no one wanted to remember. She was born into silence. Not the kind you fear in haunted houses, but the kind that lives in palaces. Velvet, polished, and cold. Charlotte of Belgium, born on June 7th, 1840, was the only daughter of King Leopold V, the first king of the young Belgian monarchy. Her mother had died when she was barely 10, and so Charlotte learned early what it meant to be alone, even when surrounded by silk and servants. They called her La Petite Reine, the little queen. A child who walked straight, spoke with poise, read Latin before the age of 10. Her tutors said she had the mind of a statesman and the eyes of a saint. But beneath the sharp mind was a softer hunger, a longing not for power, but for belonging. A mother's arms, a father's warm gaze, a world that didn't feel like an empty stage with too many curtains and not enough love. Yet she played her part. She learned to smile like marble statues smile. She learned to sit perfectly still while men spoke about alliances, marriages, empires. And she never complained, not once. Her father, King Leopold, was a man of iron will and imperial dreams. He didn't love Charlotte the way a father loves a daughter. He loved her like a pawn, a tool, a legacy. And she, like so many daughters of kings, mistook that for affection. Every letter he sent her, every compliment, she cherished like a rare flower in winter. Because when you grow up in palaces, love is measured in strategy, not warmth. Charlotte learned to hide her softness, to speak in reason, not longing. She read Machiavelli. She studied Greek tragedies. She believed earnestly that greatness was a duty, and that pain, well, pain was simply the cost. And still, she dreamed. They said she was too serious for a girl, too intense, too determined. But she wanted to be more than a duchess, married off to some minor prince. She wanted to build something, to change something, to love someone who wasn't afraid of her intelligence. That man appeared in the form of Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria. Tall, charismatic, with a voice like music and a library full of poetry. He was the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, and like Charlotte, he wasn't entirely at home in the world of kings. He spoke of the sea, of plants, of justice. He seemed tender, human. Charlotte, still only 16, fell, not in the foolish way of girls who dream of fairy tales, but in the precise, clear-eyed way of a woman who believed in destiny. She didn't see Maximilian as a fantasy. She saw him as a mission, a partner, a man she could build a future with. And when he proposed, She said yes without hesitation, not because he was an archduke, but because he looked at her, really looked at her, and didn't flinch. Their wedding in 1857 was a fairy tale of empire, glowing gowns, silver carriages, choirs echoing in marble chapels. But beneath the glitter, Charlotte believed this wasn't just ceremony. It was the beginning of something real. She wrote in her diary, "With him, I shall go to the ends of the earth, not for power, not for glory, but for the chance to do good. Let history say we tried." For the first time, she felt more than a daughter, more than a tool. She felt seen. They moved into the Miramar Castle in Trieste, a white palace by the sea, filled with light and books and laughter. Charlotte filled the gardens with rare flowers and insisted on learning Hungarian to speak to Maximilian's former sailors. She even commissioned paintings of their shared life, each one brighter than the last. For a brief, golden season, they were happy. But the sea beneath Miramar was not still. Maximilian, though charming, was restless. He wanted more than court life. He dreamed of empire, of justice, of being chosen by history. And Charlotte, loyal, brilliant, ambitious, believed in him. When the chance came to rule Mexico, a country torn by civil war and imperial manipulation, they both said yes. Not because they were naive, but because they were idealists. And idealists are the easiest to destroy. In those days, Charlotte still smiled with ease, still believed words could change hearts, still walked beside her husband, arm in arm, whispering plans and promises. She did not yet see the ghosts waiting in the palms of Mexico. She did not yet smell the blood in the soil. She did not yet taste the silence that would one day replace her voice. She was still the girl with the golden crown, still the Empress of hope, still whole. But empires are cruel, and history does not care how brightly you once believed. The letter came like a whisper wrapped in gold. It was 1863. France had sent its armies across the sea to Mexico, a nation already torn in two by civil war. Napoleon III, the French emperor with dreams bigger than his maps, was looking for a puppet, a crown, a European figurehead to stabilize the chaos and cloak France's intervention in legitimacy. And Maximilian was willing. The offer was absurd. To rule a distant land across the ocean among people they did not know, amid revolutions, betrayals, and blood. But Maximilian saw opportunity, a calling, an escape from the long shadow of his brother, Emperor Franz Joseph, who had always made him feel like a decoration, not a sovereign. Charlotte saw destiny. She didn't blink, didn't hesitate. She believed still that they could bring peace, that their youth, their vision, their good hearts would be enough, that the world would make room for idealism, even in politics. They called her Carlota, the name she would bear in Mexico, and she wore it like a new skin. In the spring of 1864, they boarded the Novara, a warship bound for a new world. Charlotte stood on the deck, her hair pinned tight, her back straighter than the mast, waving goodbye to Europe, to everything safe and known and sane. She believed she was walking into history, and she was, but not the kind she imagined. Mexico greeted them with fanfare and unease. The conservative elites bowed. The French soldiers cheered. The indigenous people watched in silence. And the liberals, who had fought to free Mexico from monarchy, seethed beneath their breath. Charlotte stepped out in ivory silk under a burning sun, with a bouquet of roses in her hand. She smiled, and it began. They were crowned in the Catedral Metropolitana of Mexico City. Maximilian and Carlota, Emperor and Empress of Mexico. It was not a fairy tale, it was theater. And behind the velvet curtain, war was already tearing at the stage. Still, Charlotte worked, tirelessly, fiercely. She traveled the country. She listened to local leaders. She shook hands, wrote letters, studied laws. While Maximilian entertained poets and hosted banquets, Charlotte was writing decrees, learning Nahuatl, touring schools and orphanages. She wanted to rule not just in title, but in truth. One witness wrote, "The Empress never sleeps. She is fire and iron beneath porcelain skin." She pushed reforms. She begged her husband to distance himself from the French and seek support from the people instead. But the empire was a ghost ship, beautiful, cursed, and doomed to sink. Outside the palace walls, Republican forces under Benito Juarez regrouped. The United States, fresh out of civil war, refused to recognize the monarchy. French troops began to die. Napoleon III grew impatient, and the Mexican people grew bitter. Charlotte felt it, in the tense faces of soldiers, in the rumors that crept like mold. She started to ask questions, desperate, pointed, whispered in corners of the palace. Will France abandon us? Will Maximilian fight or flee? What will they do to us if we lose? But the answers never came, or when they did, they were wrapped in lies. And Maximilian, gentle, naive Maximilian, began to fade. He refused to leave Mexico, refused to dissolve the throne, refused to accept that this dream might kill them. Charlotte begged him to return, to rethink. But he kissed her forehead and said, "A sovereign does not run." So she took matters into her own hands. In 1866, against all reason, Charlotte sailed back to Europe, alone, to plead for help. She believed she could save the empire, save her husband, save herself from the nightmare tightening its grip around them. She went first to Paris. Napoleon III refused to see her. Then to Austria. Her brother-in-law, the emperor, offered condolences, not aid. Then to the Vatican. She threw herself before Pope Pius X, begged him, wept, spoke of duty, of righteousness, of betrayal. Witnesses say she collapsed on the steps of the Apostolic Palace, screaming through tears, "If they abandon him, they abandon God." But no one moved. The world had made its decision. The empire was a mistake, and mistakes don't get second chances. Charlotte began to unravel. She stopped eating, slept in chairs, not beds, refused to drink anything not poured by her own hand. She feared poison in her tea, treachery in her food. She wore the same gown for days. She trembled when anyone mentioned Maximilian. And yet, she kept writing, pages and pages of letters, to anyone who might help, each one more frantic than the last. But no one answered. The Empress of Mexico had become a ghost in her own land. No carriage came, no emissary arrived, no army sailed, only silence. And by the time the world heard from her again, she was no longer Carlota, no longer Charlotte. She was a woman standing at the edge of her own mind, peering into the abyss, and beginning to fall. There was no trumpet to announce the fall, only the silence after a door slams shut. A silence that echoes longer than any war drum. While Charlotte pleaded in Europe, Maximilian remained in Mexico, alone, proud, and tragically blind. He believed the empire still stood, that the people would rally, that history would vindicate him. But history doesn't wait for dreamers, it devours them. And Mexico was already moving on. The French, once his protectors, began to retreat. Napoleon III had seen enough. The American government, after surviving its own civil war, made clear it would not tolerate a European monarchy in the Western Hemisphere. France had no stomach for a transatlantic war, no appetite for a doomed experiment. So they left, one by one. The ships vanished from the harbors. The soldiers disappeared into the mist, and Maximilian stood on the palace balcony, looking out into a city that no longer saluted him. He didn't weep. He didn't run. He simply waited, like a statue that hadn't yet realized it was cracked. Charlotte, still in Rome, still clawing for support, did not know. Or perhaps she refused to know. Each day she sent letters to Maximilian, letters filled with strategy, encouragement, pleas. Hold fast. I will return with help. God will not let us fall. I am your sword in the shadows. But there was no sword, only paper and ink, and prayers that went unanswered. The Vatican grew uneasy. She began making accusations, claiming that courtiers were conspiring against her, that her food was tainted, that the rooms themselves whispered betrayal. On one occasion, she bolted from her guest quarters, barefoot, screaming that her servants were trying to murder her. They found her trembling under an altar, reciting Hail Marys with bleeding palms. She was no longer pleading for an empire. She was pleading for reality to stay still. Meanwhile, back in Mexico, the noose tightened. Republican forces under President Benito Juarez advanced, city by city. Maximilian had loyalists, but not enough. He issued decrees, tried to rally a new army, but the people no longer heard him as a sovereign, only as a foreigner, an intruder, a failed monarch playing emperor in a country that had bled enough. In 1867, Maximilian was betrayed by one of his own generals, captured near Querétaro, imprisoned, awaiting trial. The Emperor of Mexico, brother to the Emperor of Austria, son-in-law of King Leopold, was now a prisoner of a republic he never truly ruled. Charlotte was not told. Not yet. Her mind had become too fragile. After a violent outburst in Rome, she was quietly escorted back to Belgium, her homeland, now a gilded prison. They brought her to the Château de Bouchou, a gray castle in the woods, isolated, guarded. She would never leave it again. She asked for Maximilian every morning, and when told nothing, she would murmur, "Then he must still be alive." For a while they let her believe it, because the truth would have shattered whatever fragments were still intact. And then came the final blow. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian was executed by firing squad in the hills above Querétaro. A white shirt, a blindfold, a moment of silence, and 3 bullets. He was 34. He died clutching a small portrait of Charlotte in his hand. He whispered her name before the shots rang out. Not Carlota, not Empress, just Charlotte. Just the girl he once danced with in Miramar, before they mistook dreams for destiny. The news reached Europe like thunder wrapped in velvet. Austria mourned. France deflected. Belgium fell silent. And Charlotte, she never fully knew, not in a way her broken mind could hold. There were whispers in her halls, servants sobbing behind closed doors. One day, she stared at a painting of Maximilian for hours, unmoving, unblinking. And when the candlelight flickered, she said aloud, "He'll be back before winter. He always keeps his promises." But winter came, and spring, and decades. He never returned, and she never stopped waiting. The empire they tried to build vanished from history like dust from a failed monument. No legacy, no heirs, no triumph. Only two names, Maximilian and Charlotte, etched into footnotes, whispered in museums, remembered not for their power, but for how it destroyed them. And the worst part? They weren't evil. They weren't cruel. They were idealists. And that made their fall all the more brutal. Because the world is kindest to tyrants, and most unforgiving to those who mean well. She was still wearing silk, even as her hands trembled, even as her hair frayed into wisps, even as the servants whispered behind her back. Charlotte still carried herself like an empress, posture unbroken, words sharp as crystal, crown not on her head, but behind her eyes. Because to admit she was no longer Carlota, Empress of Mexico, was to admit she was now nothing. And nothingness, to a woman who had once ruled, was a fate worse than death. After Maximilian's capture, before the world knew he would be executed, Charlotte moved through Europe like a ghost dressed in desperation. She knocked on doors built of marble, walked halls where men in medals talked about fate like it was a card game. But she wasn't playing. She was drowning. She arrived at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, demanding an audience with Napoleon III. This was the man who had once sponsored Maximilian's throne. The man who gave them false hope, then pulled out the floor from under their feet. Charlotte stood at the gates, lips dry, voice iron, and was denied. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. They told her he was indisposed, that diplomatic matters prevented a meeting, that Her Majesty should rest. She didn't rest. She raged. A few nights later, she stormed the gates again, this time screaming. Witnesses described her pounding on the iron bars with her fists, crying out in French, "You crowned him. You gave him the throne. And now you let him die." Guards restrained her. She spit on their boots. They said her eyes looked like glass on the edge of breaking. But Paris would not bend, nor would Vienna, nor the Holy Roman Church. In a final act of desperation, Charlotte turned to the only power left: God. She traveled to the Vatican, not with a carriage full of jewels, but with a suitcase of sorrow. She wore widow's black, though Maximilian still lived. She called it precaution. But deep down, part of her knew the grave had already opened. She waited in Rome for days, then weeks. And finally, they let her in. Inside the Apostolic Palace, beneath the gaze of saints and popes carved in stone, Charlotte was received by Pope Pius IX. This was no ceremonial visit. She fell to her knees, not like a queen kneels for blessing, but like a woman begging for her life. Her words were sharp, then trembling, then incoherent. "Holy Father, save him. They've betrayed us. He believes in justice. He wears a crown they gave him. You must command them. Command them to send troops." The Pope did not speak. Charlotte wept harder, not like a queen, like a girl whose world had been set on fire. She clutched his robe. She sobbed into marble floors. She muttered about letters, plots, poison, France, demons in court. And when she looked up, something was broken, not just in her voice, in her mind. The Vatican never saw her again. They quietly arranged for her removal. Whispers spread that she was unwell. Some said the devil had touched her. Others said grief had hollowed her like a bell that could no longer ring. Charlotte returned to Belgium, but this time, not as royalty. She was escorted by guards, by physicians, by family who no longer saw a daughter, but a liability. Back at the royal palace in Brussels, she was given a room far from visitors. The doors were locked at night. Servants were instructed not to contradict her. She would ask for Maximilian at dinner, set a place for him at the table, whisper in Spanish as if he were seated beside her. When they tried to tell her, gently, she would laugh softly. No, no, he's not dead. He's just in the garden. There was no garden. One morning, she was found crouched in a hallway, barefoot, holding a crucifix. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her lips were cracked. She whispered, "They're watching. They poisoned the mirrors." When her brother, King Leopold II, came to visit, she refused to speak. Not out of anger, but because she thought he was an imposter. She began writing long, rambling letters to dead relatives. She scrawled warnings on her bedroom walls in charcoal. She refused to drink water unless it was from a sealed bottle opened in her presence. Every cough became a conspiracy, every silence a trap. And through it all, she kept one portrait beside her bed. Maximilian in his white uniform, smiling faintly. She kissed it goodnight, every single night. Charlotte, once the most articulate royal in Europe, now muttered to walls and prayed to door handles. She wasn't mad in the way of fiction. She wasn't violent or monstrous. She was just lost. Inside a house her mind had built to survive the grief. And no one, not Pope, not Emperor, not brother, could bring her back. She had once ruled an empire. Now she was a woman in a locked room, writing to a dead man, wearing a wedding dress no one dared remove. It didn't happen all at once. Madness, despite what stories tell us, is not a lightning bolt. It is a leak, a slow drip, day by day, from the ceiling of the soul, until one morning you wake up and the floor is flooded. Charlotte began to lose time, minutes, then hours, then entire days. She would sit by a window, motionless, for so long that the servants would mistake her for a statue. She would blink and think it was morning, but it was dusk, and she hadn't moved. She stopped recognizing faces, old maids who had raised her, guards who had protected her, even her own brother. To her, they were strangers in masks, imposters, spies, ghosts of courtiers who had betrayed her in Rome. She tore down mirrors, not out of vanity, but terror. She once screamed at her own reflection, convinced the woman in the glass was mocking her. When they tried to calm her, she whispered, "She's smiling because he's dead. She knows." They removed every mirror from the chateau after that. But it didn't help, because Charlotte carried the reflections inside her head. She spoke to Maximilian as if he were in the next room. She left notes for him on the mantel. She asked the cook to prepare his favorite meal, almond soup with dried rose petals. One evening, she arranged 2 chairs by the fireplace and lit a candle between them. Then she sat, hands folded, lips trembling, and said, "He'll be here by the hour. Don't make a sound. He hates loud rooms." The candle burned down, the room filled with shadow, and Charlotte, eyes unblinking, waited. She didn't sleep in a bed. She slept sitting up, on wooden chairs, under tables, in linen closets. She believed the mattress contained metal instruments, planted by foreign agents to manipulate her dreams. She began hoarding objects: hairpins, gloves, old shoes, teacups. Everything had a purpose, she claimed. Their charms, for protection. She tied twine between the bedposts and the door. Barrier against the French. She refused to bathe. She believed water would open her skin, allow them to enter. She feared the steam, the mirror fog, the warmth. Because warmth reminded her of him, and remembering him was more dangerous than poison. The doctors came. Men in white gloves with kind eyes and cruel hands. They used words like female hysteria, morbid delusions, prolonged widowhood psychosis. They suggested sedatives, restraints, isolation. But how do you restrain a ghost that still thinks it's alive? Charlotte stopped speaking altogether, for weeks. Then one day, she began humming a lullaby, over and over, for hours. It was the song Maximilian had sung to her on their voyage to Mexico, back when the sea was calm and the future was possible. Now she sang it to no one, eyes fixed on the horizon outside a barred window, as if waiting for sails that would never appear. She began writing again, long letters filled with feverish script, words stacked on top of each other like bricks in a collapsing wall. The letters were addressed to Maximilian, deceased. The Pope refused delivery. The true Emperor of the Sun, unknown identity. They were filled with warnings. The crows whisper poison in my tea. They have moved the stars to spy on me. I am Charlotte of Miramar. I am not dead. Some letters were burned by the staff, others were locked away. But she never asked if anyone replied, because deep down she knew. No one was listening anymore. Her body began to mirror her mind. She grew thin, hollow, her skin bruised easily, her nails cracked. She lost her teeth. She still wore white, still combed her hair every morning, still insisted on being addressed as Empress. But the title was now a shell, worn like a crown of bones. One servant once described her as a cathedral with no mass, all marble, no music. One night, in a rare moment of lucidity, she asked the nurse, "Do you think he forgave me?" The nurse didn't know what to say. Forgave her for what? I left him. I left him. I left him. She repeated it, like a confession, like a chant to keep demons at bay. Then silence. The staff grew superstitious. Some believed the chateau was haunted, not by Charlotte, but by the version of her that used to be, the brilliant young girl, the golden empress, the fierce political mind. Now she lived among shadows, trapped inside a mind that had turned against her. A queen in a crumbling fortress, an empress crowned in grief. And the worst part? No one came for her. Not the church, not the kings, not even history. They left her in that room with nothing but ghosts and the sound of her own breathing. June 19th, 1867. A quiet hill above Querétaro, Mexico. No trumpets, no hymns, no last-minute rescues. Just dust, just wind, just death. The man standing in front of the firing squad was once called His Imperial Majesty Maximilian West of Mexico. Now he was a prisoner wearing a white shirt, his blonde hair tied back, holding a crucifix in one hand, and a small, worn portrait of Charlotte in the other. He refused a blindfold. He wanted to look them in the eyes, not out of pride, but peace. "Aim at the heart," he said. "Long live Mexico." And then the shots rang out. 3 bullets, 2 to the chest, 1 to the shoulder. He staggered, fell to his knees, and bled into the red earth he once believed he could rule. Charlotte did not hear the shots. She heard only the ticking of a clock that no longer told time. In her room in Belgium, she was rearranging forks on a silver tray, convinced each was a symbol from the Pope. When the telegram arrived at the palace, cold, official, precise, the royal household refused to show it to her. They feared what the truth would do. But the lie had already done worse. For weeks, no one told her. She still asked for him at breakfast, still brushed her hair for him at night, still set out his gloves on the mantel in case he returned from meetings. When the servants wept quietly in corners, she assumed they missed Mexico. She once said, smiling faintly, "They'll send him home before the snow comes. He hates the cold." But snow came, and so did silence, and Maximilian did not. When she finally learned the truth, it was not spoken. It arrived like a ghost, a sentence left unfinished, a glance held too long, a black ribbon on a letter that no one explained. She read it again and again, and when no words made sense, she did not scream. She simply set the letter on fire, then stood still until the ashes fell like snow on her nightgown. They say Charlotte stopped eating after that. Not out of protest, but because food lost all meaning when the person you love is no longer alive to share it with. She once looked at a plate of eggs and asked, "Why are they round if he is no longer here?" She meant it. Not as poetry, not as madness, as truth. Because when your world dies, even breakfast becomes a betrayal. The doctors increased her laudanum, but it made her hallucinations worse. She said she saw Maximilian's body walking through the hallway, dripping seawater, barefoot, eyes open, but blind. She would follow the shadow around corners, down stairwells, into closets. And when she reached nothing, she would whisper, "Max, I'm sorry I left you. I should have burned with you." That was the night they removed every candle from her room, because she had begun striking matches on her wrists. One morning, the servants found her in the garden, barefoot, covered in dew, staring at a tree stump. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "It's him, don't you see? He's inside the bark. The bullets didn't kill him. They just made him quiet." She spent 3 days talking to that stump. They never corrected her. Because what could they say? That grief doesn't make trees speak? In her world, the tree made more sense than the people. At night, she began dreaming of Mexico, not as it was, but as she remembered it. A city of golden altars, flowers blooming from stone, and Maximilian always waiting at the palace gates. She would wake up weeping, but not for what she lost. She wept because she couldn't hold on to the dream long enough. "He leaves before I can touch him," she said. "Even in sleep, he disappears. Even in dreams, grief has no mercy." The world moved on. Europe crowned new kings. Mexico buried its dead. Austria mourned quietly, more for political embarrassment than human loss. And Charlotte? Charlotte became a secret, a living reminder of a failure no one wanted to remember, a widow no one could cure, a warning with a heartbeat. Years later, someone asked a member of the Belgian court, "Why does no one visit her?" The reply was simple. Because when you see her, you remember what power cannot fix. Because you can cure a wound. You can mend a treaty. You can rewrite a war. But you cannot bring a dead man back. And you cannot pull a woman out of a grave she walks through every single day. Maximilian died quickly. A flash, a fall, a last breath. Charlotte died slowly, minute by minute, memory by memory. And even though her heart kept beating, the woman who once ruled as Empress of Mexico was already buried. In silence, in sorrow, in the soft, unrelenting madness of mourning. She outlived them all. The popes, the emperors, the prime ministers. She outlived Napoleon III. She outlived Franz Joseph. She even outlived the century itself. The world that had crowned her, abandoned her, watched her shatter, moved on. But she remained, like a candle locked in a drawer, still flickering, still consuming itself, with no one left to see the light. From 1867 to 1927, 60 years, Charlotte lived behind the ivy-covered walls of Château de Bouchoux, a quiet estate tucked into the Belgian countryside. The official term was retreat. The whispered one was containment. She was not imprisoned, but she was never truly free. Guards walked the outer grounds, not with rifles, but with quiet steps and sad eyes. Doctors came twice a month. Letters were read before reaching her, and visitors were rare, very rare. Inside the chateau, time dissolved. Curtains were kept drawn. The clock in her bedroom was stopped, deliberately, at the hour she left Rome in 1866. She said it was to pause the devil's hand. She called every morning Monday, because that was the day Maximilian used to return from official meetings, smiling with dust on his shoes. Charlotte spoke little, but when she did, it was in fragments. "He's in the carriage now. Tell the Archbishop the orchids are ready. No mirrors in the dining room. They scream when I eat." She referred to herself in the third person, as Her Majesty when she was calm, as the widow of the eagle when she wasn't. One morning, she demanded the castle bells be rung. When asked why, she answered softly, "He's landed in Veracruz. The people must know he's safe." There were no bells. There was no landing. But no one corrected her. They had learned it was kinder to let her live in the ashes of illusion than in the ruins of truth. Outside her walls, the world turned. Electricity lit the cities. Automobiles replaced horses. Kings fell. Nations rose. World War I scorched Europe. But inside her mind, it was always 1866. Maximilian was always just delayed. The empire was always recovering, and she was always waiting. Servants aged and were replaced. But the rules never changed. Never speak of Mexico. Never say the word execution. Never bring photographs newer than 1867. The chateau became a mausoleum for memories, a house where time dared not enter. Some days she painted, not portraits, not landscapes. She painted doors, dozens of them, tall doors, cracked doors, golden doors, always slightly open, always without hinges. She lined them against the walls of her drawing room. When asked what they were, she whispered, "The ways he can come home." And then she would sit in front of them for hours, listening. At Christmas time, she lit 2 candles, one for herself, one for Maximilian, always 2. Even when alone, especially when alone. Once she forgot to light his and spent the night kneeling in the snow outside, convinced she had condemned him to eternal frost. No one dared stop her. In her last decades, Charlotte's body began to fail. Arthritis turned her fingers into claws. Her eyesight dimmed. Her legs grew weak. She began speaking less, until sometimes weeks passed in silence. But her mind, the broken, brilliant, haunted mind, never stopped. It replayed scenes on a loop. Mexico City, the altar, the last kiss before she left. She once murmured, "He stood by the window. I should have stayed. He didn't say goodbye." Even 60 years later, she remembered the moment she broke and could not forgive herself for walking away. The people of Belgium eventually forgot her. Newspapers stopped reporting on Her Majesty. Children were not taught about the Mexican Empire. Her name vanished from school books, reduced to a footnote in stories about foreign misadventures. She was not mourned, not celebrated, just edited out, as if erasing her grief could erase the shame of what Europe had done. But inside the chateau, Charlotte lived on, a breathing specter. Not a queen, not a wife, not even a widow. Just a woman trapped in a timeline no one else could enter. They called it madness. They called it trauma. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was devotion so deep and undying that it outlasted reality. Maybe she refused to leave 1867 because it was the last place where he still lived. She died quietly on January 19th, 1927, aged 86. No fanfare, no state funeral. She had outlived her father, her husband, her legacy. At the end, her nurses said her last words were a whisper. "Don't forget the candle. He'll be here soon." And so she waited. Until the waiting became stillness, until stillness became peace. Or something close to it. What do we remember of an empress who never ruled? What do we do with the story of a man who dreamed too big and a woman who lost her mind trying to save him? The truth is, history never quite knew what to do with Charlotte of Belgium. She didn't die young, like Marie Antoinette, a tragic symbol. She didn't reign long enough to inspire nostalgia. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a martyr. She was something worse. A failure that lingered. Maximilian, too, was caught in the murk of conflicting narratives. To some, he was a naive idealist, a romantic monarch who tried to bring liberal reforms to a land foreign to him. To others, he was a pawn of European imperialism, a crown planted in Mexican soil by French bayonets and European arrogance. Even today, Mexican history books hesitate. Was he a tyrant in disguise, a victim of circumstance, a fool wearing a borrowed crown? He issued decrees abolishing corporal punishment. He pushed for education. He offered amnesty to rebels. But none of that could wash away the foreignness of his reign, nor the blood spilled to install him. And Charlotte? She was remembered mostly as a footnote in Maximilian's saga, the wife who went mad in Rome. Not the woman who governed Mexico while her husband hesitated. Not the strategist who crossed an ocean to beg for troops. Not the woman who watched her entire world collapse and kept breathing anyway. In the Belgian court, she became a delicate topic. Among her royal relatives, she was rarely mentioned aloud. "Poor Charlotte," they'd say. "She loved too much. The crown was too heavy." But behind those platitudes was shame, because they knew they used her. And when she broke, they hid her. Not because they didn't care, but because her story was too messy, too emotional, too human for the politics of dynasty. Even in academic circles, she remained elusive. Medical historians described her condition with terms like delusional grief psychosis, trauma-induced schizophrenia, or catatonic paranoia. But none of those terms could capture what really happened. That a young woman raised on duty and dreams was asked to carry an empire with her bare hands. And when it fell, no one caught her. Not her family, not the church, not Europe. She fell through the cracks of empire and landed in a century that didn't know what to do with her pain. Was she mad? Yes. But not from weakness, from abandonment, from the poison of hope gone rotten, from watching the man she loved walk toward death while the world turned its back. She was not born mad. She was driven there. Driven by betrayal, by politics, by history's quiet cruelty. In Mexico, her name was scrubbed from the monuments. The word Carlota became taboo in liberal circles. Her palace, Chapultepec Castle, became a museum, not to her, but to the men who came after. In Europe, she was remembered briefly after her death. A few obituaries in royal journals, a handful of black and white photos showing her elderly, frail, expressionless. Then silence, as if 60 years of exile could be summarized in a paragraph. And yet, traces remain. In Miramar Castle, her letters to Maximilian are preserved. Ink smudged, words frantic, but still filled with a voice no history book can erase. In the Vatican archives, reports of her collapse on the marble floor, weeping, begging, clawing at the robes of the Pope, lie buried among forgotten correspondences. And in Belgium, those who wander the woods near Château de Bouchou still speak in hushed tones of the lady in white, who once stared for hours into the trees, waiting for a ghost no one else could see. Some say she was cursed. Others say she was punished. But perhaps the truth is this. Charlotte of Belgium was a mirror held up to empire, to love, to history itself. And no one liked what they saw. Because in her madness, there was a clarity too terrible to face. That power cannot protect you. That love does not guarantee survival. That history forgets even those who scream the loudest, especially those who screamed into silence. She left no heirs, no dynasty, no monument carved in marble. But Charlotte of Belgium, the girl who became an empress, then a widow, then a ghost, did not disappear. She lingered. In places, in objects, in silences too deep to name. At the Château de Bouchou, where she spent the last 60 years of her life, her room was left almost untouched after her death. Not by royal order, but out of fear. No one wanted to be the one to move the chair she always sat in. No one dared remove the cracked teacup on the windowsill, still stained from her last sip. The dust, it seemed, respected her grief more than history ever had. In the corner of her bedroom, hidden beneath a sheet of lace, there was a small wooden chest. Inside, a folded wedding dress, yellowed by time, a lock of blonde hair tied with blue ribbon, a rosary carved from Mexican rosewood, and a faded portrait of Maximilian, eyes smiling faintly, corner torn, Pinned to the inside lid was a note, scrawled in Charlotte's trembling hand. "If he returns, give this to him. He will need to remember me." The chateau itself has long since been absorbed into the public park of Meise in Belgium. Tourists walk its gardens now. Few know the woman who once stared from behind the curtains as decades passed. Fewer still ask about the closed wing at the north end, the one where the furniture was never rearranged, where the wallpaper peels in the shape of crosses, and the floorboards creak like someone pacing, even when no one is there. Her grave lies at the Church of Our Lady of Lichen, among the other Belgian royals. It's simple, polished, quiet. No inscription about Mexico, no mention of her title. Just Charlotte, daughter of a king, wife of a ghost. Visitors rarely stop there. The tourists are drawn to Leopold's monument or Queen Astrid's tragic tale. But if you look closely, the roses left on Charlotte's grave are different. Older, often pressed between worn pages, as if someone, somewhere, still reads her story, still mourns what she became. In Miramara Castle, overlooking the Adriatic Sea, where she and Maximilian once lived in joy, there is a gallery dedicated to the ill-fated emperor. Portraits, letters, maps, uniforms. And tucked near the corner, a small oil painting. Charlotte seated beside a window, head slightly tilted, a faint smile on her lips. At first glance, it seems serene, but look closer. The light does not touch her face. The window shows no sky, and her eyes are not looking outward. They are fixed on something behind you, or perhaps inside you. There are no statues of her in Mexico, no streets bearing her name. She has no school, no square, no museum room. The Empress of Mexico is absent from the Mexican memory, as if erasing her could erase the intervention, the blood, the humiliation of empire. But some remember her voice. In letters Maximilian wrote from captivity, he mentions her often. She fights harder than any general. If I perish, it will be because her courage carried us too far. Even in death, he knew. She was the one who kept believing, long after belief had become a burden. And in the Vatican archives, sealed to most eyes, are transcripts from her desperate audience with Pope Pius X. Witnesses recorded her sobbing on the mosaic floor, clutching his robe, whispering things in 3 languages at once. Latin, French, Spanish. He is not dead. They said God would protect him. I drank their poison, and it tasted like promises. Some scholars believe she had a breakdown. Others say she had a vision. But no one doubts this. In that moment, Charlotte was no longer speaking to the Pope. She was speaking to history, and history, as always, said nothing back. In modern Belgium, her name appears in biographies, footnotes, dramatic plays. She is painted as tragic, as hysterical, as a lesson in imperial overreach. But few write of the letters she wrote by candlelight, long after everyone stopped replying. Few write of the walks she took barefoot in the gardens, tracing the same circle for years. Few write of how she outlived the world she built her soul around, and never forgave herself for surviving. Charlotte never set foot in Mexico again. But Mexico never left her. She heard its bells in the night, saw its red dirt in her dreams, smelled its incense in the folds of old lace. And sometimes, only sometimes, she smiled, as if for a moment, the woman she used to be, the girl who believed in justice, in love, in empire, had stepped back into the room. but only for a breath, then gone again. She left no last testament, no final speech, no dramatic gesture, only the faintest echo in the lace of a dress, the dust on a portrait, the silence of a room never entered again. And somewhere, in the unseen air between memory and forgetting, the ghost of a woman still waiting for a carriage that will never return. She was born into royalty, raised for greatness, married into empire, and broken by all three. Charlotte of Belgium was not destroyed by poison, nor by politics, nor by exile. She was destroyed by something far quieter, something history doesn't know how to document. Hope held too long. Because there is a kind of grief that doesn't scream. It waits. It sits quietly in a locked room for 60 years, still wearing the wedding dress, still setting the table for two. Charlotte didn't die when Maximilian was executed. She died every morning after, waking up to a world that refused to give her back what it took. We often romanticize royal tragedies. We turn them into operas, costumes, headlines. But Charlotte's life doesn't fit those stages. It wasn't a beautiful fall. It was a slow disintegration, not of a crown, but of a mind, of a memory, of a woman who could not make peace with a world that abandoned both her husband and the truth. History, as a storyteller, prefers heroes or villains, not widows who speak to walls, not broken women pacing hallways with a crucifix in one hand and silence in the other. But Charlotte's story matters, precisely because it doesn't resolve. She was not avenged. She was not redeemed. She was not forgiven. She just lingered, like a bruise on the skin of Europe, one that the continent tried to cover in lace and velvet, but never quite healed. She once ruled a country that didn't want her. She loved a man who believed in a dream that wasn't real. She begged gods who wouldn't listen. And in the end, she was buried among kings, but remembered by none. And yet, I remember her. I, the narrator, the voice in the shadows, the witness too late to help, but not too late to see. Because there's something in Charlotte's descent that speaks to something larger. Not just the failure of empires, but the failure of care. She was not the first woman to be used for diplomacy, then discarded. She was not the first wife told to be silent, then punished for speaking. And she won't be the last. But she is ours to remember now. As I write this, I picture her, not as the mad woman in the tower, but as a young girl in Miramar, laughing in the sunlight, still believing she could make the world better, still believing love was enough. That version of Charlotte is gone. But the question she leaves behind still burns. What does it cost to believe in something no one else does? And what happens to those left behind when history moves on, but your heart doesn't? Perhaps the most human thing about Charlotte is that she never stopped waiting. Not for power, not for forgiveness. Just for one person, the only one who ever saw her not as an asset, but as herself. In that waiting, there is pain, but also grace. Because even as her mind unraveled, she remembered how to love, even when it became unbearable, even when it made no sense. So this is not a tragedy about madness. This is a tragedy about memory. About what happens when no one else remembers with you. about what remains when the world forgets your name. But you still whisper his. If you stand in the gardens of Bushu today and close your eyes, you might feel it. A chill, a presence, a name spoken into the wind, not in rage, but in longing. And you will know. Charlotte of Belgium never really left. She's still there, still holding on, still waiting for the empire to come back, for the letter that was never sent, for the door to open for him.